Well, good day, everyone out there. Welcome to our second global dialogue on food systems resilience. My name is Michael Hauser. I'm one of the hosts, calling in from CIFOR-ICRAF in Nairobi, Kenya. In this global dialogue, we are looking at the climate risks facing Lake Victoria and also its basin, and how to move food systems around the lake into a safe operating space. And you may be wondering why Lake Victoria? Well, Lake Victoria is not just any lake. It's the largest lake in Africa. It's the second largest in the world. The lake is the lifeline for millions of people, and there are watersheds that actually start up in Burundi and Rwanda, and the Victoria Nile connects the basin and the lake to Egypt, thousands of kilometers downstream. And you can imagine that things that happen around the lake affect the lake directly. And of course, what happens in the lake and what happens with the lake affects life in the basin. And like many other regions around the world, also people in the lake basin, Lake Victoria Basin, witness environmental changes, of which some are quite dramatic. Tree cover loss and land degradation are just two of the big changes that we witness and observe. Well, then there's drought along the eastern shore and of the lake, and floods along the western shoreline in Uganda, literally at the same time. And then internal displacement that could become an even larger issue in future. Well, and at the same time, there's a lot of potential in mitigating and adapting to these changes in the lake basin across the 5 countries, Rwanda, Burundi, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania. And there's also a great potential of new forms of environmental diplomacy and coordination across the 5 member states. Well, in this global dialogue, we focus on exactly that. And we came with 2 questions. First, we want to know what are the climate security risks around the lake in the basin? And second, how could one ever manage that complexity of transboundary governance that puts sustainable farm, land and food systems at the center of the region? It is now my pleasure to introduce to you my colleague and co-host, Greg Sixt. Greg is the director of the Food and Climate Systems Transformation Alliance at J-WAFS at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Greg's calling in from Cambridge. Greg has worked on water diplomacy before and will moderate that dialogue. So Greg, let me hand over to you. You will introduce the panel, and after you've done so, I'll move into the background, listen and learn. Greg, over to you.
Thanks, Michael. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. As Michael said, I'm Greg Sixt, based in the Abdul, Latif, Jameel Water and Food Systems Lab at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. MIT leads the FACT Alliance, the Food and Climate Systems Transformation Alliance, which is a global network of research institutions and stakeholder organizations focused on addressing the most vexing food systems challenges as they relate to climate change around the world. Very pleased today to have a distinguished panel. We've got Coletha, Coletha Ruhamya, Deputy Executive Secretary of Lake Victoria Basin Commission, Kim Geheb, Senior Scientist, Integrated Natural Resource Management and Governance for CIFOR-ICRAF, which is one of the CGIAR centers, and Soed Sabagude, Acting Commissioner in charge of International and Transboundary Water Affairs, the Uganda Ministry of Water and Environment. Very pleased to have you all here. Looking forward to this active conversation. So, as Michael mentioned, I also want to introduce the project manager for the Lake Victoria Basin project that we're working on, Immaculate Adel. So thank you, Immaculate, and welcome as well. So as Michael mentioned, we got 2 parts to this, really kind of looking at some of the challenges and then looking at some of the solutions. So I'm going to dive right in some of the challenges, and I'm actually going to I'll I'll put this question out there and actually let each of you respond. And we're trying to keep our answers to 60 seconds or so each. But in the Lake Victoria Basin, forest cover has declined about 30% in the last 2 decades. And at the same time, the population in the basin is increasing at over 3.5% a year. What do you see the future in the basin looking like if these two trends continue on their current path? I'm going to ask each of you to just respond kind of what the future is like if we continue on this business as usual path. Coletha, I'll start with you first, if you don't mind responding first.
Thank you very much, Greg. You have mentioned 2 things: forest cover declining and population increase. And I think one starts to trigger the other. Population increase actually triggers other effects because they want food, they want firewood, they want water, they want everything. Then they end up using natural resources in a sustainable way. So if it continues like this, of course, we're heading in a bad situation. But the partner states and the EAC and the LVBC, that's why actually they initiated this cooperation to see how collectively the partner states that they share the lake and the basin in that, collaborate and do something to ensure we prevent that crisis. So we are trying to do that. What we are trying to do, we are trying to implement some of the projects, of course, to ensure we rehabilitate the degraded ecosystems. Some projects that will help, especially we go to nature-based solution, bringing back the ecosystem services that have been lost, but also putting in place policies and strategies to ensure all the partner states will comply to, and collectively we implement projects and programs, and also put the regulations and enforce the regulations and laws to ensure we protect these precious natural resources. So I would say there's different interventions at policy level and regulation and laws, but also some key programs and the projects on the ground to show people what is supposed to be done and how communities can be mobilized to change their way of living and go for alternative livelihood.
Great, thank you, Coletha. We're going to dive more into some of the pathways towards solutions as we move forward too. Just a couple points for some of the folks on the call. If you're not familiar with the region, yeah, EAC is East Africa Community, and LVBC is a term you may hear a lot as well. That's the Lake Victoria Basin Commission. You'll probably hear those said repeatedly. So Ed, would you like to respond to kind of, what happens? What's the future look like if we maintain business as usual? We're focusing on the challenges now, and we'll get into the solutions in a little bit. You're muted. So Ed, you're on mute.
Thank you, Greg and Michael, and for the introduction and hosting. Just to go straight to the question, if we continue as business as usual, we are likely to see the biggest challenge that the lake would face. That is further deterioration of the water quality within the shared lake, Victoria. We realize that with population growth, we are seeing increased pressure on the land. And also in view of climate change, we see populations actually going in areas where they feel they can produce more or better, for example, during periods of drought. And these are wetlands that are being encroached on because they're the last frontiers in terms of water reserves in periods of drought. We're seeing degraded catchments and then erosion increasing and leading to a loading of nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus in the Lake Victoria. And again, increasing the challenges of pollution within the lake. We see a problem of loss of soil fertility and definitely loss of production and loss of livelihoods if we continue as business as usual. This will lead to food insecurity as the population grows, and chances are that we may have to rely on perhaps food being imported from elsewhere to support the population within the basin. Those are the key challenges I see if we continue as business as usual. Thank you.
Thanks, Soed. I'm going to come back to you on one of the points you brought up there in a bit, but I'm going to hand it over to Kim now to get his kind of intro comments.
Thanks, Greg, and it's a pleasure to join this panel for this online event. I often like to say that the climate crisis is not necessarily a crisis of climate. It's more fundamentally a crisis of our institutional ability to deal with it. And I think that if it comes down to the level of business as usual being maintained, where we don't see any kind of institutional innovation, then we can expect the trajectory of many of these deleterious trends to continue. The key, from my perspective, the key characteristic that we should be concerned about with climate is lack of predictability. We don't know what's going to happen. That's the nature of complex systems. And so as a consequence, it behooves us to increase the ability of institutions to maneuver much more rapidly, to focus on innovations within them and other aspects that we'll get into in a moment. But really, we see this very much as solidly an institutional challenge for the countries of the basin, and our focus should really be directed towards them and supporting them and strengthening them. Thank you.
And thanks, Kim. And kind of building off your comment, are all the institutions or all the organizations responsible for addressing the outcomes of the challenges? How aware are they of the real, true, in your opinion, of the real, true impacts of climate change on this right now? Like, do you think all the key players are really, truly aware of the threats coming out of this right now, or is there room for kind of expanding on that?
Well, I think it's generally very difficult to anticipate what those threats are, even if we can spot them vaguely on the horizon. I think that we have the benefit of hindsight. Some of the challenges that you mentioned or Michael mentioned in the introduction, in terms of the environmental symptoms of these systemic problems, the movement of people around the lake, and so on. But as I emphasized just then, these are symptoms of systemic problems. The other dimension to all of this is that despite the fact that we have many institutions that are working extremely hard and trying to solve these, we also have very high levels of disintegration amongst them. And really what we want to see emerging out of institutional responses is far stronger transdisciplinary approaches to addressing emerging problems as they occur. Thanks,
Kim. Coletha and Soed, do you have any thoughts on this as well? In terms of, is everyone aware? Like, there are other knowledge gaps in terms of the extent of the climate challenges in the region. Coletha, I see you unmuted first, so please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Kim, for articulating on this. I think not everyone is aware, but at some point they are aware because the experience has taught us that there is a climate change. We are living with the climate change, and it will be worsened as we continue, if we continue business as usual. But the issue here is, as he put it clear, I think, this integration in terms of planning. I think we need a very strong integrated planning where we need to, all sectors and all countries come together and try to look at in the holistic approach when we plan from different sectors. And I will give an example where you find, like now we are advocating for the nature-based solutions in different aspects. But we find there's simple nature-based solutions, like when you construct constructed wetlands for the purpose of wastewater treatment. But again, you destroy another wetland that is God-given, is actually there, and it could save for the purpose as a constructed wetland. But you find, because who's implementing constructed wetland is somebody in charge of wastewater treatment. And he's constructing this constructed wetland for the purpose of wastewater treatment. But on the other hand, the same government or the same region, a certain wetland that is there to be conserved, actually to continue giving the ecosystem services to make other wetlands to be more productive, is also destroyed. So you find these gaps is still in existence, and we need to do something to ensure we are all at the same table or same understanding, and to have that integrated and the prioritization of the investment that we are doing. Thank you very much. I submit.
Thanks, Coletha. So one thing that you touched upon, and I'll drop this, I'll plant this seed and somebody can address it. If not, we can come back to it, is kind of the lack of a holistic conceptualization for the basin, right? I mean, like really just kind of pursuing solutions, one group pursuing solutions can actually create challenges or actually create maladaptions for other groups. So I'm going to kind of plant that seed now. So if that's something you want to touch on, if not, we can come back to that, because I want to continue that line a little bit about this is going to start to feed into some of the more the basin-wide challenges. But so I'll have you first respond to kind of the initial question about, you know, are all the important groups necessary to address these challenges aware of what the true extent of them?
If I may also add my voice on the discussion on that particular question. There have been efforts to try and understand the impacts of climate change on the Lake Victoria and the Basin, but this has been mainly from the perspective of the rainfall, whether we shall have more or less rainfall, whether the temperatures will increase or reduce. But what we know is that the temperatures will increase. I think the discussion has been whether the rainfall will increase or not. So different projections indicate that it will increase, and others indicate that the rainfall is likely to reduce. But I think what is not very clear, though this has been done maybe from the individual countries, but an integrated or general understanding of how other sectors would be affected within the Lake Victoria Basin. And this, for example, could look at the agriculture, how will it be affected, what crops will be impacted more than others, and what interventions we need to undertake. If we're looking at tourism, what does it mean in terms of the impacts of climate change? So I feel we don't have that body of knowledge on how other sectors are likely to be impacted from the climate change. And thank you.
So the intersectoral communication. So I'm saving some of these to come back to for discussion of solutions in our second part. But Kim, is there anything you want to come back to that I saw you nodding a bit? Anything that?
Yeah, I think that both Coletha and Sawat have raised some really great points there, and I mean, just reflecting on Coletha's example of the wetlands. I mean, these are in systems language are often referred to as cascading effects. Is that when you do something in one part of a system, then you get impacts elsewhere, and I think Sawat highlighted that very nicely. And these are often referred to as unintended consequences. And it's a key challenge that we have to confront under climate change conditions, is how do we position ourselves when those ambiguities exist, knowing that those ambiguities exist.
These actually kind of leads to, you know, because ultimately the FACT Alliance, are part of our mission is to provide actionable research, engaging, you know, with stakeholders as partners. That's research that's actionable to support action. To be a little redundant. Excuse me. So that kind of leads to the question of, what do you all think are some of the key knowledge gaps? What are some of the needs that the research needs that need to be addressed that could help address some of these challenges in the basin? And I'll leave that open to whoever kind of raises their hand first.
Can I?
Okay.
Sure, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Okay, Coletha, you can go.
We'll go Coletha, then Soed, then Kim.
Okay. Thank you very much. To me, first, I want to come back to what Soed said, that we don't know what sector will be affected more. But if there is too much rain with the degraded land, then that rain will not help us. Actually, it will lead into flooding. You know, our soil will be flowing. The fertile soil will be flowing, and the water, meaning it's going to downstream or it's feeding into our lake, and then causing the eutrophication because we'll be putting some nutrients in it, and yet we leave the land for agricultural purpose with no fertility, and then we go to buy the fertilizer to feed into the soil, and then how we feed into that soil during agricultural activities, it actually, when the rain comes, it also flows again to the water bodies. So there's something that I want to address, even if we are not sure of how the impact will be, what sector will be affected more, but we need to do something just from the knowledge you have. And I think something has been started to be done, but we can do more. Coming to where we can research more, as I was saying, when this rain flows, takes the topsoil and the water flowing to downstream, I think we need to be able to calculate or using a model to know exactly how much soil, the topsoil, is being transported downstream, and if we can also put into a mandatory value so that we can defend the investment in the catchment protection in the Ministry of Finances in our government, because you find most of the time there's not much investment is done to protect the catchment of the water bodies. If they fund the water, or they fund the water sector or agricultural sector, mostly they will fund irrigation to adapt to climate change, but they don't fund most of the catchment protection, of which I think is more important, because it will be it provides that ecosystem services, including pollination, including soil fertility, water conservation, water storage, and the like. So I'm looking in that area that most focus in terms of research. We need to look into those areas. Another area I think we should also focus on is this pollution that Soed talked about. When we say development, we are focusing, bringing industries. Those industries, some are using very bad chemicals. We are in minings of which mercury are used. So all these ends up into our water bodies. So we need to research in that area and to understand what are these emerging chemicals that are coming in the basin, and to be able to plan ahead how we can protect or mitigate the impacts. Thank you.
Thanks, Coletha. Soed.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, Coletha, what I basically meant by saying that we don't know the extent of the impact, I think we generally have knowledge of what happens when you have more rain or less rain. But what is key is the quantification, which you also hinted on. Quite often when we interface with the Ministry of Finance, when we go to ask for resources for some of the projects that we are formulating, for example, around the lake, they will tell you that, we funded the Lake Victoria Environment Management Project, phase 1. We also borrowed about $27 million to address issues within the lake basin to do with pollution and sustainable land management under the phase 2. And now they say, why do you need additional money? But we know that the problem is bigger than actually what the finances that we've received so far. So the issue of quantification of the problem is very key, because if we can quantify, for example, the degradation, where is it taking place? How much resources are we losing through loss of soil fertility as a result of erosion? And how much money can we injecting to stop this? And how much shall we be saving? So that information is missing, because it's very key in trying to mobilize resources to address the challenge that we have at hand. So I here agree with you on the last point, that we need to quantify the challenge, if it's pollution, if it's degradation, and how much do we need to address the situation, because they keep asking, how much money would you need to make sure that everything is addressed? Or when shall we know that we've addressed the land degradation challenge within the Lake Victoria? I also note that some of the practices that we are fronting through sustainable land management, these are not new practices, but perhaps there has been a problem somewhere that we need to focus on. We've had extension services previously, but are they working right now? Or how can we innovate and make sure that these services now we can leverage technology to improve on the extension services? Can we, for example, have some kind of videos that we can record and perhaps translate in local languages, and then we send out there, and farmers can see or learn on how they can do better in terms of managing their lands so that they don't erode. So we need to innovate. I'm coming to what Kim mentioned in the beginning, though he mentioned it from the institutional perspective, but also from the practice angle. We need to see how we can leverage technology to ensure that we improve, support farmers to learn some of these new practices or reinforce the old knowledge that we used to give to farmers. Thank you.
Thanks, Soed. So, I mean, one thing that to distill down some of what you were saying, there's actually no shortage of solutions we know would work. It's kind of that systemic barriers that actually prevent some of these known solutions from working, and we need to understand that better. Kim, I'm going to let you respond, and then we're going to address a question from the audience, and we're going to pivot towards solutions. So, Kim, go ahead.
Well, I think I'd build on what you said there, Greg, and also some of the important points raised by my co-panelists. I mean, in terms of knowledge gaps, those really are the key things, and I think that we have to be optimistic about the kinds of resources that the countries that share the Lake Victoria Basin can bring to the table. And here I'm thinking that we move our spotlight away from just the financial angle, even if that's important, but then also to some of the resources that Sawat was touching on, is that what are the capabilities within communities, for example. And here I'm particularly interested in community institutions and how these can actually be motivated to respond to some of these crises. Can we use community institutions as a way of, for example, reporting back on pollution trends within the basin, or flooding events, or high levels of erosion, or other environmental symptoms rather, of the broader context within which all these people live. I also think that there's a significant knowledge gap around, what I touched on just then, is that what motivates local communities to, for example, adopt new technologies, as Sawat mentioned. I think he's absolutely right around the idea of leveraging these technologies as a key systems term. But then is also, what can we do to support communities to come up with their own solutions? And what about that resource base there? There's bound to be absolutely piles of innovation in the, however many it is, 36 million plus people who live within the basin itself. So these are some of the, I think a lot of the knowledge gap is how we unlock that potential, so that we're all in the same boat after all. So what can we do to support ourselves collectively?
Thank you, everyone. Before we make the pivot, and before one thing I want to highlight, there was a question about the transboundary nature of Lake Victoria. Is it unique in in the world, and are there other areas where we can find examples of success? And we'll come back to that in a second. But that question that was on the Q&A kind of reminded me that one thing I wanted to highlight is that Lake Victoria is connected to the wider Nile Basin. One branch of the Nile starts as all of a sudden I'm forgetting the name of the city in Uganda. So, but you know, the one branch comes out of. Yes, thank you. Yeah. No, isn't it Jinja, right? Comes out of Jinja.
Jinja, yeah, around Jinja.
Yeah. The one branch starts in Jinja. So just before we kind of move on to solutions and before we address some of the questions from the audience, you know, would any of you be willing to talk about the impacts to the broader Nile if these challenges facing in the Lake Victoria Basin aren't addressed? Because these are interconnected systems, and it's not just the 5 lake countries. It's, you know, one of the most important rivers in the world. So who wants to take that one?
I could make a go. Well, okay. Indeed, these are interconnected systems. And when we see that the challenges around the Lake Victoria Basin are not addressed, then we see the impacts also pushing downstream, all the way through South Sudan to Sudan and perhaps Egypt. I would give an example. When we had the floods in 2020, you realize that much as the rains were quite enormous, but it took a very short time of about a year to get to the highest level ever recorded within Lake Victoria. But the second highest level before, actually it was the highest level before the one that we recorded in 2020, that was in 1964. We saw that highest level was reached in a period of about 2.5 years. So it took 2.5 years to raise for the lake to raise by 1.5 meters. But when we look at the recent highest levels, it took us just 1 year to reach that level. But from our analysis, we found that it's perhaps because of the degradation within the catchment that saw that quick response. Water falling in the catchment, and then finally we get runoff, that the vegetation in the 1960s was quite pristine. So we saw that gradual increase. So in future, with the increased degradation and climate change, we are likely to see that these quick responses in the lake system are likely to increase, and there will be more flooding. We saw about 1 million people that were affected in Uganda as a result of these floods. And that is for a lake that is just downstream of Lake Victoria, which is the Choga, as well as the Albert, which borders Uganda and DRC. And then South Sudan in Juba was heavily flooded, and the same applies to Sudan around Khartoum. And again, we saw some conflicts almost coming up between Uganda and, well, not conflict between the two countries, but the citizens, for example, in Kenya, were threatening to sue. Actually, they sued Uganda because they believe that the impacts or what they were seeing as floods along the Lake Victoria was as a result of Uganda's actions, which we don't believe. But of course, everyone is entitled to their opinion, and they can take whatever action they feel. But again, as the government of Uganda, we are defending ourselves in that regard. But what I'm trying to bring out is the fact that if we do not address the challenges of land degradation along the Lake Victoria Basin, we are likely to see these impacts also transcending or going all the way along the Nile up to Egypt. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Coletha, I see you just unmuted. Go ahead.
Yes, I wanted to add on what Swed has said. Basically, we know that we need to collaborate at the institutions that are working within these basins. As I speak, I was in the meeting that is a meeting that, I mean, the project that we share with the Nile Basin is supported by the World Bank on Nile Cooperation for Climate Resilience Projects. It's a project that is implemented by one component by Lake Victoria Basin Commission, but the other components are being implemented under the Nile Basin Initiative and the Centers for the Nile Basin, means NERSAP, INTRO, and what in another center, I don't remember it well. So what we are doing, like for this particular meeting that I was in, is mostly to harmonize the water quality policy in the entire region. And we are looking not only for the basin, rather we look at also the Nile Basin component, especially the Nile countries. So we are trying to see how we can collaborate and have like assessment together, and then see how we have the collective interventions for the benefit of the entire region. I just want to share that.
Thanks, Coletha. We're gonna pivot now towards solutions, but first I'm gonna bring Immaculate on to review the Q&A we've gotten so far. So Immaculate, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, Greg, and thank you to the panelists for such interesting inputs. So we have 3 questions at the moment from the audience. The first one is from Susan. She asks, the term nature-based solutions was used a few times. What kind of nature-based solutions are we talking about? Maybe a few examples could be given.
Does anyone want to take the nature-based solutions? Just a quick 30-second examples of nature-based solutions. Anybody? So we're my sense, we're talking about like agroecological practices. So integrated, diverse production systems, things like buffer strip, vegetated buffer strips along rivers and along the lake boundary. Any other nature-based solutions come to people's minds as
I think a nature-based solution is even how we design our urban systems. When you design for let's say drainage systems, where you plant some grasses, you don't just put cement and it is that increase the velocity of water. So nature-based solution is try to apply nature in our practices. How we design our urban systems, how we even as the example of constructed wetlands is part of nature-based solutions. You are trying to use nature to solve the problems, not always hard infrastructures. In other terms, sometimes we call it ecological infrastructures. That's what I can maybe explain a bit.
All right, thank you. I think that Susan, let us know if you need more information. Back to you, Immaculate.
Thank you, Greg. The second question is Abraham. Is the problem in Lake Victoria unique because it is shared among different countries? Are there success stories in the management of freshwater lakes anywhere in the world, and specifically in Africa?
Anybody?
Well, if I can make an attempt, well, I believe the challenges in Lake Victoria are not unique. And indeed, there are successes in terms of managing shared resources. But I think there are also unique aspects that we are employing to manage Lake Victoria. To me, when you look at the governance structure that is trying to make sure that there's coordinated management of the lake between the countries that share the lake, as well as the basin. This puts Lake Victoria in a unique situation whereby at least there's an appreciation at the highest level possible, in that decisions or issues that concern Lake Victoria can easily reach the heads of states of these countries. I believe that is a unique arrangement for Lake Victoria that maybe other lakes may not be able to have that kind of arrangement. But also countries being able to come together and cooperate to make sure that they try to save Lake Victoria, to me is also, even to the extent of trying to borrow money to make sure that they control pollution, is also one of the key successes on Lake Victoria. Though the problem has not been fully addressed, but you find that there's a willingness to address the challenge together with all the countries that share the lake. So I believe those are some of the unique arrangements for Lake Victoria. Though I've not given an example of a lake that has successfully been managed elsewhere in the world, I can ask maybe my other panelists to give an example where this has been a success besides on Lake Victoria. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's take that as a carryover into the next question, along with the third question that Michael's going to read, and then we'll use that to lead us into some solutions here.
Sure. Thank you, Greg. I just have one contribution from David Lele mentioning that, or adding to the list of the nature-based solutions, that's the use of biochar. Then I'll move to the third and last question. That is, the conservation of natural resource is maintaining the public good service. Under this condition, who should bear the cost of conservation? Is it the community close to the lake, or the larger national or continental or global community? That is from Solomon.
So we'll take that question and the larger transboundary coordination, and basically, talk about the nature of these problems aren't point-based. The actions in the upper watershed impact the lower watershed. Actions along the lake have impacts throughout the whole Nile Basin. So from your perspectives, what does kind of a multilateral governance look like in the basin? Like, how do we address some of these challenges? And Kim, I haven't called on you for a bit, so I'm going to hand this football over to you and get your thoughts, because I know you also work on transboundary issues quite a bit. You've done some work in the Mekong. So kind of your thoughts on the basin and transboundary governance and adaptive governance.
Well, I think generally speaking, the principal challenge in all transboundary natural resources is sovereignty, and how radically that's actually exercised. So countries can get terribly sensitive about transboundary things, and I think that the examples touched upon earlier regarding downstream impacts of changes within the Lake Victoria are a good illustration of how sensitive some of these issues can actually be. But I also think it's really important to recast those kinds of issues and to begin thinking about cooperation around some shared resource, less in sovereignty terms and much more in terms of collaboration terms. And that it is very, very possible. We also need to kind of decouple sovereignty issues from matters of territory and more focused on sharing of capabilities. And that's also incredibly important. And I think that for an organization like LBBC, what the member countries really need to think about is empowering LBBC to function less as an organization representing the member states and more as an organization representing a shared resource and trying to come up with commonly developed and implemented solutions. I also think that very often when we look globally, and this really is a very common problem, is that governments have a tendency to not empower such transboundary resource organizations. We have a tendency also to think about that very much in terms of regulation. It doesn't have to be about regulation. A lot of governments find it very difficult to accept that a transboundary is coming in and suggesting that things ought to be done in different ways. And so as a consequence, we need to, again, shift the focus away from these kinds of contentious issues into where we can focus much more on, for example, innovation and collaboration around institutions. Just one final point there is that we should also remember that there are institutional frameworks that work very well. I mean, the EU is a very strong example of an incredibly powerful institutional structure. And I think that, you know, a lot of the language that we employ when we are talking about transboundary organizations is win-win solutions. That's a phrase that I get a little bit tired of. I don't think there are win-win solutions. I think that we have to arrive at compromise. And so if, for example, in the case of Uganda, Burundi gets 60% of what they wanted, and Uganda gets 60% of what they wanted, then the total is 120, and that's better than 100. So we really need to focus on working out around compromise.
Thanks, Kim. So building off of that, to Coletha and so, you know, where do you see as the opportunities for fostering, building off of the collaboration that LVBC's already, you know, the foundation that's already laid? Where do you see as some of the opportunities to build some of those stronger linkages, some of those direct collaboration potential? One area, one thing I'll throw out there is that, go ahead, Soed.
If you can come again.
Kind of taking Kim's thought process a little further and thinking about where the real tangible opportunities are for collaboration. So one thing to actually come back to our earlier discussion about kind of knowledge gaps. You know, could the region itself, you know, have a comparative advantage to produce knowledge, right? To fill some of those knowledge gaps. There's 5 countries with a lot of knowledge, and there's a lot of overlapping interests. You know, Kim, what are the opportunities for integrating that knowledge? Where are these areas that allow us to collaborate to move the ball forward? Any thoughts?
Thank you, Greg. Well, as you noted that knowledge, I think, as they say, knowledge is power. And if the LVBC is going to be empowered to spearhead this cooperation, they need to collaborate with other institutions, for example, have the cooperative advantage to generate knowledge. And this could be, for example, research institutions or academic institutions to build that body of knowledge. As we mentioned, LVBC should be the go-to institution if anyone has a question on, for example, Lake Victoria. If we may ask, how much resources do we need to put into the basin to address the issues of land degradation? LVBC should have this information from a basin-wide perspective rather than a country-level information. For example, if we may ask, how much cages can the lake, for example, sustainably carry? Okay, LVBC should be able to give that global picture and say this is the safe carrying capacity when it comes to cage fish farming, and beyond this, then we are straining the lake. So I feel like LVBC need to partner with these institutions as well as the partner states in terms of generating this information. It should not be just LVBC developing the knowledge or the information and then giving to partner states, but these should be working together, okay? Because if countries are able to participate in the generation of this knowledge, then they can appreciate and also take it up better. So I feel that collaboration should involve LVBC, the partner states, experts, as well as other partners like research institutions or academic institutions in generating this body of knowledge. Thank you.
Can I?
Yes, please. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. I just want to add what my colleague has said. Actually, what we are doing at LVBC, of course, you haven't done much. I would say not much as you are supposed to do. But we are working, we have started now to work on the State of the Basin report, of which we have more information on how the basin is. And the State of the Basin report will actually generate some data and to put the monitoring that will show how the basin is being either improving depending on the intervention that are being implemented by different partners, or if it's deteriorating and see what action can be taken. And that will be coupled by the water information system that also will capture some of the parameters and be able to feed it into the system. But again, to come back on what he said, the collaboration is very key. And in that aspect, we are working closely with the Lake Victoria Fisheries Organization that is in charge of fisheries. So we look at that aspect that we are now developing a project together to look for financing. And some of the areas that we could work on is to see how the water in the lake can be well managed, of course, including pollution, but also that aspect of how many cages it can be supported by the lake and things like that. So it's an area that we need to improve. Of course, we still have room to improve. But what I want to say is collaboration with the other institutions and the other key stakeholders, of course, including partner states, is a key for us to perform. I want also to respond on someone, I think, asked on the conservation, the public goods, who will incur the cost. To me, I think there is some interventions in the area of conservation that we don't need even to compensate. It's just to educate our communities. I will give an example of when we were implemented, I think Soed knows, when we were implementing the LIVEM2 projects. I remember one of the activities was to demarcate the buffer zone for the lakes and rivers. Where maybe I give an example for Rwanda because that's where I was working by then, where the lake, you should demarcate for 50 meters, and then the rivers, you demarcate for 10 meters buffer zone. But I can tell you, of course, community at the beginning, you are resisting not to encroach that part of the land. Though in the law is clear that this land is not yours, but because communities have been used to use that part of the land for food production, and I understand why, because that's where the fertile soil is, and that's where they could get access easily for water. So when we demarcated that land and support the community to go beyond the buffer zone, of course, by giving maybe water supply, supporting them to get manure, and then the production had increased in their land. So they just bought in the idea of protecting the buffer zone. And in the same spirit, some of the communities were also supported to go for fishing, and the fish could increase in the water bodies because that buffer was protected. So those are the areas that we need to educate our communities on the ground to take responsibility in terms of protection of the environment and also show the benefit out of it. And that is easy to buy and it's a plus for them. Thank you.
Great, thank you everyone. We are down to 4 minutes. I'm going to pivot to Immaculate to see if we can get 1 or 2 audience questions in, 1-sentence responses, and then we'll close out with a positive vision. So Immaculate, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Greg, and I apologize if I miss out on anyone's questions. So I'll pick out on this question that is talking about carbon financing, and this is from Philip from Tororo, Uganda. I think 1 or 2 counties in Kenya, example Murang'a County, have adopted agroecology in their development plan. Also, there's a national policy in Kenya and other countries around Lake Victoria to apply tree buffer zones along the rivers. So the question is, how can this be implemented? Kim mentioned community-based solutions, creating awareness among the community and involving them in research and monitoring. Maybe, is there a potential on carbon financing to restore these buffer zones?
We'll start with Kim, since he was mentioned in the thing. Kim, 1 to 2 sentences response.
Yeah, I mean, the whole carbon credit thing is such a mess, and not least around all of the verification debates at the moment, and also in terms of the complexity of being able to get accredited in order to receive carbon credits is also highly complicated. And it basically means that only really large institutions can invest both the time and the money in order to get accreditation. And so that we really have to, and this behooves an organization such as my own, is to come up with solutions for how we can create easier, more simple to apply to, and more democratic solutions to ensure that climate financing can get down to local levels.
Thanks, Kim. Do Coletha or Soad have a response to that? If not, we can do some closing comments. And we're looking at the time and realizing we're 2 minutes out.
Actually, Kim has just said it best. This is quite complicated. And at the moment, discussions are still at the highest level within our national governments. But hopefully that we shall try to improve and make the processes much easier as we move along. Yeah, but at the moment, everything is at the national level, and we are trying to make sure that we come up with guidelines or regulations on how this can easily be done, and then these resources can be accessed to do the actual tree planting on the ground that even the local communities can easily access. Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to close on a positive note. You know, I started out with a question on what are some of the challenges, but we've got 3 great minds in this panel here, people who've been working in the region extensively. In your, 15-second response, in the Lake Victoria Basin, what's the positive benefit that the basin has that can help solve these challenges? Like there's a lot of work going on. So if you could just kind of close with the positive vision of kind of where you see opportunity and where you see benefit coming. Coletha, I'll start with you.
I don't know if I got you well. Where do you see LVBC has the opportunity?
In the basin, not just LVBC. If you look at the Lake Victoria Basin, we focused on the challenges in the basin, right? But there's so much incredible knowledge and capabilities within the basin. So where do you see, what are the opportunities for addressing these challenges to you?
Thank you very much, Greg. I think the opportunities are there. First, to have support from our partner states, from the high level to the lowest level. I see it as an opportunity because you have that support, and when you request support, we are given, though not 100%, but at least there's somewhere you can go to and advocate. Another point, we have some institutions, I think including other institutions that are research-based institutions that we can work together to establish the knowledge that is missing, and including actually the institution out of the basin. I know we have been working with the FACT Alliance, and we see another opportunity to continue working with them to at least for studies and research. Another opportunity that I see, there's some best practice within the basin in different countries. And those are the areas that we can also leverage and maybe share best practice from one country to another, from one community to another, and at least implement what is within our capacity that doesn't even need a lot of finance, a lot of innovation, rather to implement what you have at hand and implement it well and can bring some impacts. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Coletha. Kim.
Well, early on in this conversation, we mentioned population growth within the basin. I think there's a danger in problematizing that and not regarding it as a really important resource. The youth is incredibly motivated, increasingly concerned about what's going on in the world, and are a key part of the solution to the problems confronting the Lake Victoria Basin, but also climate change generally. And then secondly, in a rather twisted way, I think that climate change also represents an opportunity for collaboration, because we can't solve climate change without collaboration.
Thanks, Kim. And Soed, you get the final word. And you're muted. Wait, Soed, you're on mute.
Yeah, two opportunities that I can easily point out, and perhaps this can also lead to can open other doors. One, there's the appreciation of the problems and the importance of Lake Victoria as a shared resource. I think the partner states know that the pollution challenges within the lake as a result of inflows, the effluents and nutrients from the land to the lake. This problem is well appreciated, and countries are willing to address this challenge as partners. Two is the legal establishment of the Lake Victoria Basin Commission, which is established by the protocol and also as an act of parliament. This makes it attractive for development partners to work with. So I feel that with this standing, they can easily attract resources to address the challenges within Lake Victoria and its basin. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that was a very quick hour, even, and a very engaging hour. And I want to thank everyone. And Soed, thank you for joining us at the last minute. I didn't mention this at the beginning. We had a panel mix-up, panel shake-up, I should say. We had to change panel at the last minute. And Soed, thank you for stepping in and helping this conversation move forward. This has been a dialogue of the Food and Climate Systems Transformation Alliance, the FACT Alliance, supported by the Jameel Water and Food Systems Lab at MIT and coordinated by BOKU University of Vienna with support from CIFOR-ICRAF, World Agroforestry. I want to thank you all again. Found this really interesting. And Michael, any final comments?
No, apart from Asante Sana, brilliant conversation, and we'll take this forward.
Yes, thank you all. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.